It's so much.
Okay, so are we on Zoom Live?
We are.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I see that. All right. I'll take my mask off. Hello, I'm Dee Denver. I'm a professor here in the Department of Integrative Biology. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rebekah Sinclair, who's going to be giving today's seminar. I came across Rebekah's work looking for other kinds of work and found the title of one of her papers that blew me away. It sounded super awesome. We've been kind of dialogue about it ever since, and we're starting to kind of collaborate together. So I'll give a brief rundown, very brief, of Rebekah's background. Got a BA in Religion and Theology from Cincinnati Christian University in 2007, 2010 an MA in Philosophy and Religion from Fairmont University. Then just August, I think, right? Graduated with a PhD from the University of Oregon in philosophy. And her dissertation title was Species Trouble, from Settled Species Discourse to Ethical Species Pluralism. So one thing I think Rebekah's great at is titles and wordplay. So settled, I think, is an interesting word she uses in clever ways. Let's see here. Won lots of awards. Won the Philosophy Matters Prize twice. University of Oregon. And has published 11 peer-reviewed articles.
13.
Oh, sorry. Because I just graduated. The updated, right? I'm working off of it, obviously. So just defended in August and just started a faculty position here at Oregon State University this fall. So super excited, and I think lucky to have her. So she's with the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. Just an example of the teaching she's doing. This term, teaching worldviews and environmental values in the fall /course is going to teach Native American philosophies. I'm also, before I'll give a few example titles before I turn it over to Rebekah, because I said her titles are awesome. I also want to make sure I say we're meeting at Downward Dog after this, and I'm buying the first round of drinks for whoever comes. Okay? So it's like celebration. Hey!
So you need this, come to the beer, yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay. Sorry, this embarrasses you, but I think that's right. Okay, perfect. Unsettling species concepts through indigenous knowledge, implications for ethics and science. This is the one that got me. Exploding individuals, engaging indigenous logic and decolonizing science. And this is one that apparently looks like you maybe didn't get to present because COVID came. CRISPR today on insects, ethics, and extinction tech in the end times. So that was a COVID era. I'm throwing it over back.
Oh, that was such a delicious introduction. Although I didn't know you were going to mention the Christian school I went to. I wish I'd known that. Do you want to put the mask on? Okay, just wanted to check. All right. So what I'm presenting today is actually a version of the Exploding Individuals paper with a different title because we need to have different titles under CE. So this is a different title, but it's just going to be a similar paper. All right, so welcome and thanks for coming. And I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So I'm a settler who lives in Calapooya and Sahaptin territory, just south of here in what settlers call Eugene. But here I'm standing on the land of the Marys River and the Epinefu band of Calapooya, who were forcibly removed from their homelands in 1855 to reservations in Western Oregon. But despite these long histories of attempted erasure and genocide, these people and members of other Indigenous nations are still here, ongoing and contributing and leading members of our communities and our ecosystems. So this work that I'm going to present here is, among other things, an attempt to point toward right relations and to listen to and center Indigenous voices, even in places and debates and ways that might not at first seem intuitive. All right. So there's a growing trend among non-Indigenous, or what we might also call Western or classically trained scientists, to gather scientific knowledge from Indigenous traditional knowledge. So scientists of all sorts are increasingly inviting Indigenous communities to share their wealth of ecological knowledge of various plants and animal groups, population sizes and distribution through the years or centuries, various ecological relations and management practices, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, of course, a bit of a welcome change from the historical clashes between Native peoples and scientists, where the knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities were often treated as mythical speculation compared to settler science, which was understood as itself a logical, evidence-based, fact-gathering endeavor. But this kind of cross-cultural knowledge exchange is also fraught with a lot of challenges and pitfalls. And one of these is the tendency for Western scientists to treat Indigenous ecological knowledge, or what's often called traditional knowledge, as raw and objective data, and as isolable from the sustaining epistemological beliefs, ontologies, spiritualities, and politics that give rise to that knowledge in the first place. This tendency places any deeper engagements between, for example, Indigenous and Western scientific epistemologies outside the parameters of engagement, and can serve to confine Indigenous knowledge to its purely supplemental value to Western science. Furthermore, this tendency to see fact and data, but not the epistemic practices or underlying relations between truth claims, can lead to the dismissal of important aspects of Indigenous epistemologies, aspects that I take to be key to those responsible engagement with these Indigenous communities, and I think to an improved and deeper level of scientific knowledge. So for Shawnee logician Thomas Norton Smith, one such element of Indigenous epistemologies that frequently gets excluded from these conversations is native logic. He argues that North American settlers actually used the differences between their own and native logical systems to justify the cultural genocide and erasure of Indigenous peoples and their knowledges. By claiming that the native logics were incoherent, invalid, and irrational, settlers understood native communities as in need of both religious and scientific education and correction. So one of the key differences between classical and native logic is this very technical thing called the possibility of true contradictions, which I'll explain more in a moment, but briefly, here's what that means. So in classical logical systems, which is most of them, propositions or statements have to have only one of two values, true or false. These are called binary systems. But American Indian logics are what's known as pair-consistent systems, which means, among other things, that they have the possibility of more than two values, so true, false, and both. For many American Indian communities, true contradictions are a really crucial manifestation of their belief in a non-binary world. And thus, it's a problem that Indigenous epistemologies are characterized by a logical principle that classical logic, which is really the paradigm in which science operates, renders fundamentally unacceptable. So often, despite the best of intentions by scientists doing cross-cultural research, the organizing epistemological principles of the West, which are governed by this impossibility of true contradictions, can function as part of what Patrick Wolf calls a logic of elimination that supports and rationalizes settler colonialism and prioritizes Western science over Indigenous knowledges. So as somebody working at the intersection of environmental philosophy, science, and policy on the one hand, philosophy of biology, and Native American philosophy on the other, I think it's super important to think not just about the data that can be shared, but about these deeper epistemic commitments that are involved in generating the knowledge, and at times preventing certain knowledge claims from being legible or shared in the first place. So since logic is one key epistemic tool, what I want to do in this project is amplify the voices of Indigenous scholars to explore how these Indigenous logics can be useful, especially in terms of their dialogue with science. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how much you love logic, in order to do this, I have to start in section 1 by just explaining and challenging some of the limits of classical logic. So I'm going to focus on the issue of true contradictions and demonstrate why that's a kind of insufficient way of going about doing logic. Then in section 2, I'm going to explore Native American thought more fully, and I'm going to focus on why Indigenous logics make visible certain aspects of the world that are often excluded or ignored by the classical logic, and also by quite a few scientists and philosophers thereof. And then in my third section, I'm going to show that native logics can bring important insights to key debates in the life sciences. Specifically, I'm going to consider the problem of the biological individual. By bringing together Indigenous philosophy and philosophy of biology, I hope to show that Indigenous, which called third value validating epistemologies, have something to teach us about the limits of our own Western epistemologies and perhaps about the non-binary nature of the world. And I also hope to build both a case and a tentative model for kind of productive and perhaps deeper or sort of sub-data conversations between native logic and the sciences. All right, so for me, this project is really about an ongoing effort to kind of decolonize my classroom and my philosophical areas of interest and my research and writing. So while I here focus on the problem of the biological individual, I actually think this kind of logical or epistemic framework is really helpful for tons of other areas like the species problem, which I work on in my dissertation, perhaps the individual organism, environment, individual boundaries, perhaps some microbial stuff, etc. And I'm especially interested to see how or if this kind of thinking is useful for you in your classrooms and your research as well. All right, so part 1, this is the part where we do a bit of logic, which you probably have already been doing in these science seminars, since logic's everywhere, or we probably haven't been doing it the same way that I'm about to. So my apologies. All right, so classical logic is governed by 2 very famous laws that, despite sounding incredibly technical, are actually really familiar and intuitive to anybody with a secular colonial education or Eurocentric education. And these are the laws of the excluded middle, which you can just ignore that, but that's basically the claim that a statement has to either be true or false, but cannot be both, or indeterminate. And then the law of non-contradiction, which claims that 2 opposite statements cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. In logical systems governed by these rules, propositions have only one of 2 values, true or false. In classical symbolic logic, then true contradictions entail what's called the principle of explosion. That is, when you end up with something like a true contradiction, or when you find yourself in a place where it seems like 2 opposite things are true, then the classical laws of logic cease to make sense, and all sense disintegrates into a realm that anything does. Things explode, so they say, which is why I call them exploding individuals. All right. Thus, if you acknowledge or accept a contradiction, you're already in logical error, so it really doesn't matter what kind of thing you say after that, because anything can be true in a world where logical order does not hold. So to be clear, this is the kind of reasoning that means that a statement like I am an individual and I am not an individual cannot be true, because if they were, we lose all rational meaning. The sciences, largely following logicians like Quine, have been pretty committed to these kinds of principles. All right, so then stepping back from classical logic, we have paraconsistent logics. They, like the Indigenous logics I will address, have 2 primary concerns with this position on true contradictions. First, they worry about the sufficiency of true value logics. They worry, in other words, that there are certain aspects of the world that can't be accounted for on this 2-value system. So consider, if you will, the famous liar's paradox. Right? The sentence is false. Now, this sentence necessitates at least a 3rd value, that is the value of both, because it has to be, right? It's rationally obligatory that the sentence be true and false at the same time. But there are also other kinds of contradictions that might concern, for example, inconsistent laws and the rights and obligations that an agent might have in virtue of these. So let's look at an example from an Australian county whose constitution contains 2 contradictory clauses. 1, no Aborigine shall have the right to vote, and 2, all property holders shall have the right to vote. Now, of course, one hopes to resolve this situation so that one of the, and hopefully the more just of the 2 circumstances comes to be true. But before this resolution, this contradiction remains true. And in order to resolve it, we have to bring additional criteria to bear. In this case, hopefully some idea of justice. But those criteria are not logically necessitated or entailed by the premises themselves, because you have to have something else involved. You have to have a choice at work. As this example demonstrates, true contradictions are thus about more than sort of abstract symbols and letters. The deeper concern is really that 2-valued logics can sometimes struggle to account for, or to name, or to make visible the real conditions of contradictions in which people might live. So in order to address these problems, we need something more than a true-false binary. Now, seminal Choctaw logician Anne Waters argues that this insistence that the world conform to classical logic or else explode is part of a Platonic legacy where truth is conceived of as kind of immaterial and mental and unchanging and abstract. And by inextricably linking this abstract to the good and the truth, we basically have created a hierarchy in which the non-changing and abstract forms of truth are valued higher and more significantly than the impure and material world, which often only is enacted in this way that confounds our reason. So this really led to strict divisions and hierarchies between the abstract and the concrete and nature. And as a result, classical logic really divides the sort of form or the syllogism from any kind of content that might fill that, emptying these abstractions of their relations to the actual material world, but then strives to reapply this logical structure to the world in the expectation that everything's going to fit into it. So for Norton Smith and Ann Waters and other Indigenous logicians, classical logic then fails precisely on this account when it's unable to make sense of, or perhaps refuses to see, that real problems and contradictions do exist in the world and not just in our heads. In other words, certain states of the world do appear to refuse to conform to classical logic, and for that we need something more than a true-false binary. So the second concern with the classical assessment of true contradictions has to do with this principle of explosion, which again assumes that just anything can follow from an inconsistency or contradiction because you stopped having the world make sense. But what if we thought about the fact that all contradictions might not be the same, and they might not all entail the same things or lead to the same conclusion? In other words, they might not all lead to explosion. So consider the possibility that contradictions have a similar status to other statements. And as with other statements, certain things follow from them and certain things don't. So A and not A, or I can vote and I cannot vote, is not the same statement. And it doesn't entail the same thing as B and not B, or I am an individual and I am not an individual, or I am light and I am a particle. And furthermore, things don't simply explode when we address these in our lives. So think of the bind of the Aboriginal property owner. Some things are for sure tailed from that, and something's got to happen, but we don't suppose that from that contradiction, we also get to the claim that Donald Trump's hair is a mind-controlling alien, or that the moon is a large lip and a large egg laid by a prehistoric space dinosaur. Great, Dr. Fans in that room, that's reference. But if you are following classical logic, then the Aboriginal voting contradiction would land us with a hatched moon and the colonization of Earth by orange toupees, because everything would explode and cease to make sense. So we see similar issues in quantum mechanics. Schrödinger, the irresponsible cat companion, created his thought experiment precisely to demonstrate that this contradictory state of matter supposed by certain interpretations of quantum mechanics must be resolved to fit with precisely these laws, the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. But it hasn't, at least to my knowledge, and as of this morning, as far as I know, right? Light is both away and a particle. So it seems that there are some true contradictions that might be conditioning the very materiality of the world, and yet things don't explode. And I think, and these Indigenous scholars think that only the logic can address these more complicated realities without quite so much panic. So now let's turn to Indigenous logic. So American Indians have a long and diverse history of resisting and enforcing the settler colonial rule that was expressed through the imposition of Eurocentric logics. But more recently, Native philosophers have begun to translate this work into fully fledged logical systems that are in the form of propositional and predicate logic, which I definitely will not be boring you with today. But this has been part of basically an ongoing effort to demonstrate that Native epistemologies, which have often looked nonsensical and outlandish to untrained settler eyes, do actually represent fully functioning, logically consistent worlds that are governed by consistent rules and demonstrable through propositional languages. It's a problem, I think, that non-native people need to see Native logics formulated like this in order to take them seriously. But Native scholars nevertheless continue to very generously demonstrate to us that not only are their logics complete and valid, but they can also serve as valuable alternatives when we face certain limits of classical logic. So again, the key difference between classical and Indigenous logics that I'm tracking here is the various relationships to true contradictions. So American Indian logics, in contrast to the classical logics, are non-binary, which is to say that they are discrete and non-discrete and non-dualistic logics. They contain more than two values, right? P and not P in both, or true or false in both. As Norton Smith states, within American Indian logical worlds, neither the law of contradiction nor the law of the excluded middle necessarily holds. It can be the case that something is P and not P at the same time and in the same sense, without one excluding the other. There are circumstances in which a proposition can be true and false, or opposite propositions can be true, or where an entity might have and not have a certain property. So Waters suggests, another logician suggests that Indigenous many-valued logics are made possible by particular aspects of Indigenous epistemologies, that affirm the fluidity, relationships, and change of categories and identities, rather than their permanence and fixed essence. So that is to say that unlike the Aboriginal property owner conundrum, these contradictions aren't really something that we're looking to necessarily take as in need of being resolved. We can let them sit as true contradictions. They're understood to just be part of the fabric of the world, the structure of the possibility for truth claims, and not just a fault of ours for impartial knowledge. So Waters suggests that Indigenous epistemologies are thus governed by truth claims that are inclusive rather than exclusive, and they observe non-discrete or unbounded entities rather than discretely bounded ones. So supported by an epistemological approach that renders the world and its categories much more multiplicitous and fluid and complex and entangled, Indigenous logics offer solutions to problems that arise from the laws of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. And they provide resources for recognizing aspects of the world that Western binary logics sometimes just fail to see. So although this formalization of Indigenous logic through the sort of syllogisms and whatnot is really valuable, I think, to the logician and to the teacher who is invested in exposing students, be they philosophy or biology students, to Indigenous logics, actually the most robust accounts of these logics come not in propositional form. They're found instead in Indigenous histories and traditional knowledges, in stories about morality and politics, and the environment, and contemporary writings. So I'm going to explore just two examples of the use of this third value logic in this paper here. The first demonstrates the way that Indigenous logics render visible complicated and conflicting truths about political, ethical, and ecological relations. And then the second example, but also focuses on ecological relations, while gesturing a bit more toward the importance of true contradictions for engagement between Indigenous and non-Indigenous science, particularly around the idea of ecosystem restoration. All right, so the first one. In her play, The Girl Who Swam Forever, which is a super great play, I suggest you all read, Anishinaabe and Canadian Métis author Marie Cummins tells the story of a cat sea girl named Forever, who is also known as a sturgeon, and her brother Ray, who's also called Brother Big Eyes, who's also an owl. Now the story takes place in the 60s on a river near a Catholic boarding school from which the girl Forever is escaping. But it also takes place in an earlier time when Sister Sturgeon and first enters the native river, and when Brother Owl first commits to watching his sister from the trees. So in other words, this play is simultaneously a creation story, a history of ecological relations between sturgeon, owl, rivers, trees, etc., and a story about contemporary colonization. So this story is set against the backdrop of colonial logic, in which Indigenous boys and girls are expected to abandon their histories, epistemologies, and ecological knowledge to become civilized by white institutions. However, Forever escapes this boarding school, falls in love with a white boy as she spends her new free days swimming in the river and becoming a sturgeon. Her brother Big Eyes, is angry at their mutual colonization and really grieved by Forever's plight at the school, but he's also distressed by her wallowing in the river and by her love and choice of sexual partners. He really tries to control and police her body and her desires, regulating her really complexly burgeoning identity and the child that she bears, which is neither white nor not white, native nor not native, but somehow both. So this story affirms this truth value of both in a couple ways. So first of all, Forever is both human and non-human, present and ancient, and her fluidity defies the categories that colonial entities want to place on her. It is only because of this simultaneity of the human and animal self that Forever is able to escape the oppression of the human-centered thought, and that she can imagine a world that doesn't undermine her agency or her embeddedness with land and her non-human kin. Ray, her brother, is also human and non-human, present and ancient. He's also both oppressed by the standards of purity and uniformity imposed by separate colonialism, and oppressor, imposing on Forever these same standards. And without acknowledging both of Ray's relationships to oppression, we miss a kind of fundamental aspect of the way colonization changes gender norms and relational dynamics. Highlighting Forever's simultaneous human and non-human status also allows us to understand her as human, that is a creature governed by religious and colonial norms that attempt to control her sapient language, knowledge, and desires, and as a sturgeon, a being that is always already tied to land and water, who belongs uniquely to that place, and who always manages to slip free of the colonization norms. So supposing a strictly two-valued logic in which both isn't possible precludes the recognition of the complex and contradictory nature of colonization that the author is trying to convey in this play. All right, now the second example, in their article Muskrat Theories, a group of Indigenous scholars and activists that I'll call Bang et al. After here, very familiarly, Bang et al. Use a similar logic in their discussion of land, education, and ecological restoration. The group affirms the idea of a willful contradiction or true contradiction, which rejects the binary logic of colonization that generates a sort of us, them, or either or dichotomy instead. They define a willful contradiction as an intent to work within the tension between seeing the world as a shifting, messy place and having a kind of desire for real ecological change. In other words, Indigenous epistemologies resist the temptation to flatten the world into a set of either or propositions, or to propose a linear history, which places Indigenous lives and relations to land and ecological knowledge as always knowledge of the past. Instead, as part of the decolonial imaginary, they affirm these complex and never settled shape and ecological relations between these Indigenous lives and the land in ways that resist colonial logic. So Bang et al. Look, for example, to the lands of Chicago, known by its people as Chicago, as an example of this willful contradiction. They remind us that Chicago was established by the settler removal of Indigenous peoples and by the filling in of wetlands. Yet, the Indigenous people are not removed, but they're still present everywhere, intermingling and co-creating Chicago culture and life and ecosystem. And the wetlands are not totally filled in or erased, as native wetland plants like tobacco grow up through the concrete. They insist Chicago is a wetland that becomes part prairie and part oak savanna. It's hard to see with the layers of colonial fill, but actually it's hiding in plain sight. The wetlands are still themselves. So Acema, which is the name of the wild tobacco, grows in the cracks of the pavement as land and water continue their dynamic and non-binary relationship in these cracks of Chicago. And importantly here, for these authors, Chicago, this land is both Chicago and Chautauqua. It both is and is not wetland. As part of their decolonial resistance, Bang et al. Willfully inhabit these true contradictions, resisting the colonial logic. These lands both are and are not wetlands still, and Indigenous lives are and are not removed. If one tries to read this as a synthesis rather than as a contradiction, we run the risk of invisibilizing the material and natural forces that push and pull these bodies and places in different directions with opposing aims. To say that it's partially wetland, or that the wetlands are reclaiming Chicago, really misses the reality that, in a very real sense, the land has always been a wetland, even though sometimes it's also been otherwise. That is, to acknowledge Chicago and Chicago as a contradiction helps us to track that opposite things are true in this world at the same time, as well as the ways that this contradiction is a source of resistance for Indigenous peoples. All right, so let's turn to biology or philosophy of biology here. So I've argued so far, and hopefully you've been following, that Indigenous logics affirm true contradictions as viable, valid, and epistemically permissible, but also sometimes necessary. They play an important role in making legible not only political realities, but also ecological and biological relations and bodies. So now I want to propose that the life sciences can have much to gain from engaging this aspect of native epistemology. To make this case, I want to consider one significant and current question that I think might result in true contradiction and that might be aided by this logic, and that is the world composed of biological individuals as opposed to something like more complex multiplicities or groups? And if so, why can we not find a single set of criteria to designate and identify all the things we take to be individuals? So usually I'm presenting to a philosophy crowd and they know nothing about the problem of the biological individual at all. And I can safely assume that you all know substantially more, so I won't go into too much detail here, but let me instead, if I may, outline the problem in kind of philosophical terms and what I take to be some of the sort of stakes of this debate. So the problem of biological individuality, which is what it is and how we count individuals, represents a kind of massive biological dilemma that could be framed in terms of a contradiction. So this is an important problem not only because the biological individual can be a sort of taken for granted or assumed feature within a lot of life sciences, and one wonders why a paradoxical answer to this question doesn't throw the sciences into crisis or make things explode, as the logicians might say. But it's also important, and perhaps even more so, because answers to these questions, or the problem of biological individuality, could potentially gesture toward a more entangled and relational view of the universe that's a lot more akin to Indigenous perspectives than to the classically Western and highly individualist ones. So both scientists and philosophers have critically documented the historical tendency to treat essential and clearly delineated individuals as the basis for both science and politics. And this tendency has been a really long and huge part of a wider settler colonial project that justifies the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples, their relational science, and their knowledge. Thus, bringing Indigenous logics to bear on this particular issue, I think, starts the conversation between Indigenous logic and the sciences, and a place where the stakes for both seem quite high, and where they stay also, I think, stand to make some great progress. So perhaps the most common way of framing the debate around biological individuality is as a problem of insufficient criteria. In other words, perhaps it's just an epistemic problem and a failure to imagine or to discover the criteria that would finally, at the end of the day, sufficiently capture all the things we take to be individuals. In her aptly titled essay, The Problem with Biological Individuality, Ellen Clark suggests that at the level of intuition, individuals are kind of merely familiar skin-bound entities, right? So basic everyday on the street kind of notion of individual. But the numerous sets of criteria that define what counts as a biological individual mostly disagree. Not only do these sets of criteria contradict one another at pretty much every turn, but they also fail on their own terms when they're unable to identify at least some of the bodies that we would intuitively take to be individuals. That is, some criteria leave out entities we would consider individuals, while others include entities like ant colonies that most would not consider individuals. The problem, in short, is that many things we want to identify as individuals for the purposes of tracking or predicting or protecting their genes, productivity, and bodies, etc., turn out to be multiplicities on many of these definitions, while many of the things that we want for those exact same reasons to track as groups turn out to be individuals. So let's just consider 3 of the 9 criteria for individuality that Clark lays out. So first, the definition of an individual by the spatial boundaries. So this one suggests that individuals are spatially discrete phenomena with their parts attached to just each other and nothing else. So this is a criterion that allows the rhizomatic fungi or aspen growth to count as a single individual in the same way and to the same degree as an octopus or a dog or you. Or even if one agrees that Pando, the world's largest colony of aspen, is an individual, is it fair to say that Pando is an individual in the same way as a rhinoceros, a dolphin, or even a single tree? What does that kind of statement miss? And now that I mention it, right, plants are also a particularly difficult group to count as individuals, since many of them are both clonal and modular groups and individuals at kind of the same time. So then second criteria, the genotype model, suggests that individuals have a unique genotype different from others of its species. But already this definition conflicts with the former. You consider clones, one of my favorite sci-fi tropes, right? 2 entities, discrete in space, but with identical genotypes, would count as individuals in one system, but not in another. Or better still, consider the Portuguese man of war, a collection of genetically identical individuals who are physically distinct and responsible for different processes, reproduction, floating, feeding, but who are connected by a single digestive tract and who cannot live or survive without one another. So how do we categorize entities on these 2 models? So third, the immuno-self definition considers the way that parts get integrated such that the whole recognizes and defends itself against entities that are not itself, right? So immune responses. But how then do we understand the parts of an individual's genetic material that its own body resists, such as cancer cells or autoimmune diseases? And this also raises the problem of functional integration. So how can we explain the acceptance and necessity of things like microbes within supposedly closed systems like those of mammals? Indeed, the microbial revolution has jostled the idea of the individual quite thoroughly, at least in philosophy biology, and plunged us kind of into an emergent mess of true contradictions. In recent years, biologists have proposed alternative paradigms, even like the holobiont or the hologenome or the superorganism or ecosystem, to better understand how humans and microbes might act together, both evolutionarily, genetically, and functionally. If we use the criterion of genetic sameness for individuality, these microbes are not part of the human individual, of any human, or any mammal, or anything. But if we use this criteria of functional integration, which suggests that a symbiont and host, and I know those aren't the right words for microbes, but can be integrated into each other's life systems, then microbes might be considered part of us as individuals. So which is it? In general, the result of these contradictions leads to some pretty unintuitive claims that the Portuguese man of war, which looks and operates like an individual, instead becomes a colony, while the tongue-eating louse, who chews out and replaces the tongue of a fish and then functionally integrates into its physical system, counts as a biological individual with its fish. I just love that example. You should look that up on your phones like right now. It's an amazing example. But none of these claims actually seem sufficient to explain really what's going on. So one strategy for solving this problem has been to simply give up on the idea that a single criterion can name every possible individual. Instead, let's just say that each science can have its own criteria to correspond with the aspects of life it hopes to track and measure. In other words, we'll just name it an epistemological shortcoming, call it a day, go out for beer, right? But as Karen Kavaka suggests, this doesn't really so much solve the debate as move the marker of disagreement to whether or not narrow criteria are themselves adequate. In Kavaka's diagnosis, the concept of the individual is so fundamental as taken for granted ground, or become an assumed category for so much good science, that many scientists feel they can't even do that good science without a clear individual paradigm. But for Kavaka, the individual concept is not necessarily a good condition for good science, but it's rather led to the privileging of certain concepts over the material and empirical complexity of the world. So as long as at least some scientists take the idea of the individual as a kind of foundation of good inquiry, and as long as they're likewise committed to the impossibility of true contradictions, that is the impossibility that something can be an individual and not an individual at the same time, we might remain trapped in and thwarted by our efforts to produce a single non-contradictory definition. But what if, just as forever, the girl fish is both a human and a sturgeon, and an electron is both a wave and a particle, Earth's creatures are both individuals and not individuals at the same time? In their affirmation of true contradictions, Indigenous logics provide, I think, 3 resources for analyzing this problem. So first, native logics privilege complex observations of the world over fixed conceptual logical equations. So for Rebekah, as well as for other Indigenous traditions, the problem lies with prioritizing concepts and propositional relations, right, logical relations, into which we then force the world to fit or else explode. But for native logics, it makes very little sense to have a crisis because the world doesn't fit into your concepts or logics if the whole goal of these logics is to understand the world. True contradictions are one way to affirm that our propositions and statements, and that the relations between these statements, matter only so long as they can actually predict and attend to real relations of bodies. So framed as an epistemic attention to the kind of complexities of the concrete, rather than the privileging of the abstract, this solution recalls what Pueblo scholar Rebekah claims, that native science attunes its concepts and propositions to the shifting and multiplicitous nature of the world, letting new questions and new theoretical paradigms and new logics arise from the complexities that are out there. So Indigenous scientific knowledge thus focuses on incorporating observations, even when they don't align with our current conceptual or logical frameworks, and we revise our organization of the world accordingly. So then the second tool is that Indigenous paraconsistent logics affirm that contradictions are not based in errors in knowledge that can one day necessarily be resolved, although that's a possibility they allow for. By accepting that contradictions might be true and permissible, we move away from the claim that some ultimate or unifying intellectual or epistemological criteria is required if we just simply observe the world long enough. Instead of finding ways of solving the contradiction, being careful about what is entailed from these true contradictions and how we arrive there, we can take this newest epistemic approach. And what would happen? What kinds of questions might we ask? What kinds of experiments might we conduct? And what kinds of relations might we see and be able to predict if we change to this new logical structure? We would perhaps instead find novel ways of tracking specific conflicting kinds of information rather than having to find out which one of those information is permanently right. And we could find new ways of holding these conflicting answers in tension. Of course, a multiplicity of perspectives and tactics are still going to be required, but those would need to be developed within the confines of a kind of mutual dependence between the kind of epistemic registers of theoretical biology and the kind of empirical. So the third tool, I think, is that because Indigenous logics are entwined with beliefs about a non-binary universe that's composed of non-discrete and unbounded entities, using these logics to affirm the individual as a true contradiction, both multiplicitous and singular, opens us on to more relational views of the world. Recall that many Indigenous communities already affirm the possibility of complex entities that are not strictly singular and individual, but are both multiple and quite commonly more than one thing at once. These true contradictions are not only crucial for rendering certain harms legible, they're also crucial for resisting colonial either-or logics of exclusion, and for prompting a kind of decolonial epistemic imagining that allows us to have a source for resisting colonial logics. So recognizing ourselves and others as simultaneously singular and multiple removes the logical injunctions for a unified and coherent identity, while also permitting us to track the ways and the times when those kinds of specific relations actually do match our experiences. To admit that we are at the same time ecosystems, physically irreducible networks of cohabitants, perhaps enables us to simultaneously attune ourselves to the embedded and relational aspects of nature and of our world. In other words, this would help us to track and predict altogether different kinds of phenomena. In other words, we don't have to give up that logical system, right? We can keep that one and track certain kinds of things and have this one and keep track other kinds of things. So what if, in other words, the man of war and the ant colony and the fungus group and the dog and the human with its microbes are all both an individual and a multiplicity? And of course, what if this meant that the world didn't explode? And what if it didn't mean that anything at all could be entailed? Something does follow from the contradiction of an individual and a non-individual, but it looks a lot more like an adjustment of scientific inquiry and an engagement with indigenous logics and ontologies, rather than a total loss of all meaning and sense. At the very least, I think we now know that we don't need to look into something like the box with the cat in order to see something like a true contradiction. Or we could just look to an ocean or an anthill or a mirror or under our feet the next time we're in a forest. All right, so I've delivered what's probably a really unconventional approach and paper in this biology seminar, and I'm sure many of you are not buying it. But I think that this kind of deeper epistemic engagement with indigenous knowledge, that is engagement that's not just at the level of kind of extracting facts and data, but at the level of engaging the relation between statements and truth claims, is a super important aspect, a crucial aspect of cross-cultural knowledge exchange. And I think that it would be hugely helpful in facilitating communication, where Native communities use these formulas to make certain knowledge claims legible that would otherwise be really tough for classically trained scientists operating within different logics to swallow. But I also remain convinced that this kind of work could be helpful for addressing other kinds of problems in biology, or perhaps even similar problems like definitions of the organism, the species problem, which again I'm very interested in. And furthermore, I'm wondering what it might look like to teach this kind of epistemic approach in biology or in environmental science classrooms. What kinds of hypotheses and research questions and insights might emerge? Ultimately, my hope is that continuing to dwell at the intersection of logic and science and indigenous philosophy can kind of invalidate, can validate indigenous lives and epistemologies, but also clarifying the importance of having a plurality of logical systems and giving us really the tools to decide when, and the responsibility of knowing when we need to choose which logical system to be applying. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Right. Happy to take questions. Teresa, you'll let us know if Zoom questions come in. Let's start. So I'm gonna also remind about downward dog afterward. Okay, talk with Rebekah and I and others. So let's hear from the Zoom folks first. They're probably less likely to come down.
This is Francis. Go ahead, Francis.
Hi, Rebekah. Thank you. That was stimulating, to say the least. Can you hear me okay?
Francis, you're up.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Work to put it in the chat.
Yeah,
Can you
we
hear
just
me?
did it in the chat.
Okay.
I'll try. Okay.
Okay, I'll start with a question. While we're waiting on Francis. Great talk. I'm curious about sort of you expressed this sort of so indigenous logicians, philosophers, the need to put their thinking in Western terms, in logic terms. I'm curious kind of what that's looked like. Like as these people have, like what years did that come about?
Okay.
And what kind of pre-existence before that was going on, like writings and things like that.
Yeah. So, all right. So it came about as more and more indigenous folks went into philosophy programs and realized that they were taking logic classes that didn't coincide with what they were being told. So there are other kinds of pair-consistent logics, but they're usually only taught in extremely advanced philosophy classes. So what they were really getting was straight up traditional classical logic, and they were like, "What is happening? This is what I've been taught." Really well. So it was, and this was happening probably in the 90s, early 2000s actually. So that's when kind of Waters and Thomas Norton Smith were doing this big work. This was also coinciding with other moves in philosophy, people, working to build, it's kind of jargony, but to build other theories of like possible worlds and all these other things that were going on in philosophy at the time. And indigenous logicians were really building off of some of those people that were using consistent logic to do really cool things in Western epistemology. But the goal of formalizing them was really just to say, like, hey, we've been saying this thing that sounds stupid to you, but like, let me prove to you with P's and Q's and not P's and not Q's and this weird mathematical system that it's legit, right? And suddenly when they did that, people were like, oh, well, now that you do that, you got it, right? Which, yeah, so that's sort of a little bit of the history of how it came about. But yeah, I don't know if that got
Yeah,
it.
perfect.
Yeah.
That's really interesting talk. I feel like I have a million thoughts that are not well formed.
Oh, those are my favorites. So that's wonderful.
Yes, one thing I was thinking about, and you were just alluding to it too, is I was thinking about statistics and what stats actually
Yeah.
do,
Mhm.
and then how we interpret them. Because in kind of old school, like basic statistics, we form a null hypothesis and alternative.
Yeah.
We get a p-value, which really is telling us how often something might be true.
Mhm.
But we interpret it as, oh, that accepts or rejects
Yes.
these two possible hypotheses. So people do you think about that and how biologists are using stats, and maybe that stats are actually conforming to this alternative way of thinking more?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But I need to do more with biologists probably to have that unfold. That wouldn't surprise me at all, because again, I think that's sort of exactly what the indigenous logicians are arguing, that it is the case that the world is, you're discovering something, and then in order to be intelligible, probably, there's a lot that's just like, in order to be intelligible disciplinarily, right? Can you publish something that's like, oh, stats are interesting, but not totally clear, right? Like, is that something that you can make a career on? I don't know, probably not, right? You couldn't in philosophy, so I don't know, how did you get over here? So yeah, the problem is sort of the way that the logical structures get enforced. It's not actually, I give a couple of examples, but I think there are probably just tons of examples where the data that you're getting is so much more complex, and it doesn't need to be crammed in, but that's the way we make sense of the world. You have to have one or the other, and so that's the way that things move forward.
Yeah, it makes me think about outliers too, that
Yeah.
in a lot of cases we're trained, well, if it's more than 2 standard deviations from the mean, you can just ignore it.
Yes, right.
When really those might be the most interesting
Exactly.
cases. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. That's super interesting. Yeah, I'll have to think about that and build on that. I'll write that down. Yeah. So that was actually the more interesting. I had no interesting responses, but that's just really cool. That's a really cool direction to take this. So thank you.
Something here in the chat recently.
I don't actually have that open. So
Not yet.
Okay.
The question in the corner.
Oh, hello.
So you've shown examples of how traditional logic systems can't function when you have a contradiction of two states. And is another solution rather than using Indigenous logic to dispel the concept of categories, like rather than saying
Totally.
it's a category as a way that it's a category as part to say that there are no categories, or just be like completely nihilistic in the concept of naming?
Yeah. So that's actually like, that's one approach to the species problem, for example. The limitivist approach is basically just, let's stop saying there's such a thing as species. Why do you need the category in the first place? And I think you find that in other areas of biology. So yeah, this eliminativist approach is one way of going about it, just saying this is a problem of categories. And that has always been a way that philosophers like to go about things, because once you make it a category problem, like that's our domain, So we love that. Once you make it a category problem, that's where we jump in. And that is, again, that is an approach that some people are taking. So what's I think most interesting about the indigenous logic is that it's not really unlike, I think, certain classical perspectives, which they're kind of left at that place, right? If you take a classical logic perspective, then it's like, all right, well, you either, notice the either or logic again, you either take a classical logic perspective, or you have to get rid of the category entirely, right? That's a very binary way of thinking about how you proceed. And the indigenous logic is just like, well, what if there's a third option? But you don't have to get rid of the category in order to continue to make sense of things. You could keep the category, but understand the category functions differently than you might think it does. So then you're not quite getting rid of the category, and you're also not understanding it as a category problem. You're giving the kind of data, the contradictory data receiving a higher status by recognizing that both things might be true, rather than minimizing it or getting rid of your classical logic thing. So yeah, I think the importance of the logic is just to say, there is a third option that nobody really explores, but we could explore this. Not because it's the best option, but because it's one option on the table. Just kind of vocalizing that and exploring what that might look like. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna try to let Francis talk again.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Francis, are you talking?
Can you all hear me? Hello?
Still not here. Okay. I do have a question from Dave. And it says, how is this not a question of semantics, how words are defined? The issue of statistics can seem to be problematic to people who've taken classes on how to use statistics, but make sense to people who've taken classes on the math behind statistical behind statistical methods.
Is that the end?
That's it.
Okay. So the question is, why is it just not a question of semantics?
Yes.
The question? I mean, I think my answer to that would unfortunately be like probably pretty similar to the answer I just gave to the question about categories. I don't know that I am committed to saying it's not a question of semantics. You know, in an attempt to solve these kinds of problems, like people have been working on this for a really long time, and they come up with a lot of answers, one of which is probably just, hey, this is problem semantics. One of which is, let's just get rid of category, right? There are lots of them. And I think I'm not trying to state a much bolder claim that this is the only way to solve it, or that this problem is necessarily a problem in the world, you know, that has to go through this route. That would be a much bolder claim, and that's like dissertation level sort of work, not 40 minutes, you know, in this kind of setting work. But I don't know why I would want to do that, because it seems to me that what the people that I'm kind of dialoguing with or engaged with are making claims that it isn't a semantic problem, and they are seeking real solutions in the world, and they do find it like a genuine epistemic dilemma that makes it difficult to do certain kinds of science. And it's to those folks that I'm kind of responding, not that this is just a semantic problem kind of response. So I mean, that's perhaps an opting out, but it's also just a way of saying I'm not committed to saying it's not. If that's the direction you want to go, that's one totally viable option. This isn't the solution to the problem. It's just one way of trying to conceptualize how we've gone about thinking about the problem so far, or a kind of mainstream way of going about thinking about it, and then one alternative way of thinking about it. But that's probably going to be a super unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry about that, but yeah.
You could talk about like the diversity of Native American logic. Like you sort of presented it as like indigenous logic, but I'm thinking just, you know, like we know about the diversity of cultures and languages that were on this continent and are on this continent. Yes, I'm assuming that there's got to be a lot of diversity in logic as well.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I did notice that when I was reading, I had a huge paragraph about how you can't just play all native groups, and somehow that got cut. So I feel really bad about that. So thank you for bringing this up. I will say that one problem that Indigenous communities find is that, you know, through colonization and processes of homogenization, a lot of the complexities of their worlds have gotten squashed a bit. And the people that I'm looking toward are making the claim essentially that Indigenous logics function paraconsistently, pretty much, okay, Native American, I should say, logics focus pretty consistently in a paraconsistent way. And paraconsistent logics, the thing that binds them is true contradictions. They have a lot of other things, but like that's a key, you know, or more than 3 values, or more than 2 values. So true, false, and at least both. So that's what unifies Indigenous logics, and that is as pretty much as far as they've gone. So, I mean, I don't know, yeah. So logical systems are actually like really, you know, they're intense. Yeah, I was floored. They're really intense, yeah. And I know, and their point is not really to build those out in ways that are different, like a Shawnee one and a Cherokee one and a Pueblo one, and this, and like, over here, Q, and K system, and this system, like that's classical logic stuff. But more to just show how working within these frameworks, you can come up with syllogisms and, statements that make sense. So that's perhaps a very long-winded way of saying that the logicians that I'm following, which is like 4, not many, are not building out whole systems that are completely separate from other paraconsistent, logical universes. They're mostly saying, let's put the claims that we've been making about our logical systems into terms that people understand, instead of developing like Plum would develop your own system and Pierce developed some system of this, it's not really that approach to logic. But were I focused on logic rather than biology and indigenous pairings, I might go in search of such a thing or work to do that. But so there isn't much more detail in terms of the way the systems function. It's just, and they take that. I started my answer by saying basically that, they've been kind of homogenized as all conversation because they're making the claim that they're indigenous logics by saying that they're more similar to one another the way these logics function than they are to classical logics, which is why the specific sort of like wording they use to articulate why they call them indigenous, when in fact, obviously indigeneity is, infinitely complex and diverse and not at all monolithic. So, yeah.
Francis, anybody try again?
Yeah, well, I'm just gonna read it. So he says, how universal is the primacy of non-duality-based logic systems across non-Western cultures? Is the world that clearly dualistic? And then he follows up with, I worry a bit that we might portray duality-centric logic too simplistically. In ecology, we think about scale dependence a lot to resolve potential paradoxes. In life, I understand my son to be Asian and non-Asian without contradiction. That's it.
Okay, can you read the beginning part of that again?
Yep. I read
Sorry, Francis.
How universal is the primacy of non-duality-based logic systems across non-Western cultures? Is the world that clearly dualistic?
Yeah. Well, probably no to the second part. It's not that dualistic. And I realized that I probably did overuse the word indigenous when I was really speaking about Native Americans specifically. So I'm not making a claim about, Maori logic systems really at all. I don't know anything about Maori logic systems, or if they've done the tedious work of articulating systems. So I would not go as far as to say that there's somehow only the West has binary structures and everybody outside the West doesn't, right? That would be a ridiculous claim. And I'm not trying to make that claim. So I don't think that binaries, I don't want to make that binary structure. The second part of the question was a question of scale. Is that right? Yeah, again, I think that's another really interesting way of doing it. I think one of the things that that some of the authors that I'm working with here, some indigenous scholars and some of the non-native scientists, we're talking about some not necessarily getting around the problem when you move to scale. When you move scales, right, you can go smaller or larger, and you might still end up with the problem criterion, for example. I mean, I'm talking to you, I know you're not Francis, but like, can I do that? Thank you. So it's not necessary. You don't necessarily get around the problem. You might temporarily, but you might also just move the problem to a different register. And this is trying to provide a way of perhaps being able to articulate things that don't just say, well, let's move the scale. Now, there's nothing wrong with moving scale. And of course, that's another viable option. So again, I don't want to create this, I don't want to have this binary where I've said, oh no, here I am today to tell you indigenous logicians have solved this problem for you, and just, so everybody can sleep better tonight, right? That's definitely not my point. It's just that we have resources that aren't usually tapped into because of just the way, the way the system, the way the logical systems work, such that you think when you end up with a contradiction, you think, aha, I have to do something, I have to resolve this, right? Like I must resolve this, and I have to do that for moving the scale. they're doing this, they're doing this. And this is sort of saying, well, what if you don't actually have to, like, what if we just didn't resolve it? What if resolution wasn't the only focus and we sat and evaluated the contradiction in a slightly different way? So that's one way of answering. What if we just didn't try to move toward resolution, scale or otherwise? Although those are not bad. And I don't think any of the people I'm reading it, certainly I wouldn't say that's a bad option. Just like the semantic isn't a bad option, just like getting, thinking of it as categorical isn't a bad option. This is just one way to push against the urge to see that lack of resolution as a problem, right? That needs to be solved in a certain way.
Couple more.
Yeah.
Like you had your own earlier.
You may have spoken to some of this, and I'm trying to figure out how this plays a role in doing the decolonizing work in academia, especially because it seems to have larger implications.
Totally.
And how do you sort of see that getting continue to be started, and how does that teach towards that? I mean, I think you just said you're researching that, but I'm very curious where you're headed towards in that.
Yeah, well, I would say one thing is, I've been trying to, we've been working sort of on thinking about how you teach this in like, an intro to biology seminar and what that would look like to bring other kinds of, epistemological approaches in.
How about chemistry?
Well, way to pick the thing I probably least familiar.
We'll talk later.
Yeah, you tell me, right? I have no idea how to go about doing that. Yeah, I would say so. Like in my own classrooms, the way that I go about doing this. Well, first of all, I mean, most of my classes, whatever they say I'm teaching, I'm actually just teaching like some version of Indigenous and environmental, animal something or other. And so I ground most of what I do in Indigenous thought, and I'm mostly, so I have like 5 students here, so they're probably gonna be like, does she do that? No, you can tell me if I don't. But I mostly try to produce tensions and conflicts without resolving them, and to let things sort of sit and simmer and stew, and let that be where we want to go, rather than a lot of philosophy is, it's propositional, it's trying to move forward, it's trying to be like, that was wrong, this guy, I mean, a lot of that's just scholarship, it's, that's how you publish papers, by saying the person before you didn't know anything, and I know everything, and so that's kind of like how it works, but I try not to teach like that, and to begin with these sort of complexities, and then say, no one's saying anybody's, we're just trying to sit with these tensions a little bit, and just to get more comfortable with that, I also teach a lot of things, I teach a lot of pieces where people are making claims that might seem really outlandish to Western ears, and then try to, again, have folks sort of sit with that and really figure out what it means from an epistemological standpoint, like how are these claims about making certain things visible, right? How can we see them as truth claims, rather than saying them as seen as like religious or spiritual things, that are like outside over here that we're not going to talk about, but be like, what kinds of aspects of the world does this epistemological approach that the mountain, has agency, like what is that making visible, and how can we sit with that for a minute before just saying, nope, that's weird, and so that's, I mean, I think how to teach and decolonize your classroom is like such an interesting and impossible and difficult topic, and no one's doing it perfectly or even maybe well, but I would love to talk more about how to do that, so
Yeah, with the increasing westernization of Native American cultures, what would you say is the current prevalence of Indigenous logic in the United States?
in what setting? Like, you mean in the academy, or you mean?
Like if I went to, I do a lot of reporting results back to communities, and so
Okay.
I'm wondering like
Interesting.
whether they still use that current logic system.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. That seems like an empirical question. I have no way of at all knowing. But at the same time, I can say that I work with a lot of, people who, this is one of the reasons why the examples that I used are like, they're current, right? I'm not relying on some sort of story that was an origin story or whatever, right? I'm like, look at this author who's writing right now. Look at these other people who are also writing right now. And so one of the authors that I follow really closely is Megan Bang. And her stuff I see is like super involved in this. And sometimes I even, the case that you kind of have to take this approach in order to understand what she's trying to do with the project. Now, that's not the same thing as talking about how Indigenous communities do it, which is obviously different than how Indigenous academics might do something. But one way that I'm trying to track it as a current thing that Indigenous Native American people are trying to insist we recognize is to look at authors, to look at news stories, to look at, ways that Indigenous peoples are describing environmental harms, to look at the accounts of Western and kind of Indigenous knowledge sharing, and to see how the Native peoples are articulating their knowledge and where things are getting mistranslated with the scientists. So, I mean, all I really did was tell you like 5 places I'm looking, and not really answer the question of how prevalent it is, because that is a kind of speculative question I'm not trying to answer fully. But I think it's a question that, you have to have a sense of what the logic is in order to be able to recognize it and be able to see it when it shows up. And it's going to be, now that you have one, I don't know, maybe you'll see that where it's coming up, so you can tell me. But it's definitely in the Indigenous communities that I've worked with in the past, but Southern California and up here, I find it kind of a lot in the way that they give accounts of things and both their histories, current political problems, and all sorts of things. And yeah, again, a lot of contemporary sort of cross-cultural scientific stuff with communities, accounts of invasive species and extinction and all these sorts of things. You can see this logic, I think, to some extent. So yeah, but it does, that's a real question, yeah. So I don't want to be putting this forward as like, this is what every Indigenous person thinks, when actually Indigenous people are like, crazy, that doesn't make any sense. We don't think like that. I don't want to be misrepresenting anybody. So it might be another problem with academics and communities kind of miscommunicating. What I might use mostly academics or playwrights and authors, public voices, I should say. So, but yeah, that's a really interesting. I should keep track of that. Very careful.
Anything else on Zoom?
I mean, I'm not leaving until you grab me for beer, so we
Okay.
can stay as long as.
5:05. We're gonna call that a seminar. Thank you very much, guys.